Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Fall Organic Vegetable Gardening, presented by the Woodlands Township's Environmental Services Department. And our speaker today is going to be Dr. Bob Randall, who you can see on the screen, and I'll introduce him in just a few minutes. We're really excited today to have about 230 people registered for this class, and we want to thank you for joining us. My name's Ann Hall, and I'm an environmental education specialist with the Woodlands Township. The Environmental Services Department is really happy to have this opportunity to offer our fall organic vegetable gardening class in a new format. Our department has lots of information for you, including classes, community events in the areas of recycling, solid waste, sustainable gardening, water conservation, and mosquito surveillance. And you can check out our offerings on the Woodlands Township's website. Today, to give everyone the best experience, we would like to ask you to keep your microphone muted and turn off your camera. And to answer your questions, we're going to be using the chat function. So type your questions into the chat space, and at the end of each of our 3 sessions, Dr. Randall will answer as many of your questions as possible. Our agenda includes setting up the vegetable garden, climate-wise gardening at your location, good veggies for the fall and winter and how to grow them, and a planting schedule summary, which Dr. Randall will give us at the end. Every session will end with a 10-minute question and answer and a 10-minute break. This time, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Bob Randall, who, as we all know, really needs no introduction. He's so known in our area and has so much expertise to offer us. I'd like to share a little bit about his background. He grew up in New Jersey, where he learned to value local fruits and vegetables growing on his grandfather's farm, and he has brought that knowledge with him all of his life. He received his PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley, and while he was living there, he became interested in community gardening. He has grown home gardens in California and on Vancouver Island before moving to Houston in 1979 to teach at the University of Houston. At the same time, he started a home vegetable garden in Houston. During the 1980s, he volunteered for the Houston Interfaith Hunger Coalition. In 1987, Dr. Randall began working full-time for this hunger coalition. He started community gardens at this time in Houston's 4th Ward, and he ended up establishing 42 community gardens. In 1994, Dr. Randall worked together with a group of people to found Houston's Urban Harvest. He served as their first executive director until 2008. At this time, he continues to volunteer for Urban Harvest, teaching permaculture and organic gardening. Dr. Randall is the published author of Year-Round Vegetables, Fruits and Flowers for Metro Houston, and this was recently published in the 12th edition. He continues to maintain his own vegetable garden, including many fruit trees, at his home in Houston. And with his garden and his fruit trees, he grows 90% of he and his wife's diet. So with this illustrious background, I would like to turn the meeting over to Dr. Bob Randall, who will lead you through his presentation. Dr. Randall.
Thank you, Ann. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about fall and early winter vegetables and really report on work I've been doing over the last 10 years or so, trying to figure out how we can do a good job growing food plants in what I think is a really changing climate. This is a really 3-part session. The first part of the talk is basically on how you set up a vegetable garden. It's part of the broader thing, how do you design a whole home lot and it would get me way beyond that if we started talking about that. But the vegetable garden is part of the rest of your life. And so you can't really entirely talk about one without the other. But anyway, that's what we're going to do, is focus on how you set up the vegetable garden. And then I'm going to talk about the differences around Southeast Texas in terms of climate a bit, and what's happening to the climate and how that affects what you plant and where you plant it. And then the longest section will be toward the end, where we'll talk about things that you can grow in the Woodlands area, broadly speaking, for a lot of wonderful things to eat. And we are going to have an opportunity to answer some questions after each segment, and we're going to have a break. So the first part, the design and setup, is at least 4 things I want to talk about, and this is the outline of what this first session will be. I'm gathering that some of you are very accomplished gardeners and farmers, maybe have been doing this for years. Others of you are just thinking about doing this for the first time. It's always a challenge to talk to a group that includes everything from beginners to basically accomplished experts. But anyway, there are all sorts of possibilities. These are just many, many ways you can think about vegetable gardens, how attractive they might be. I have this thing on a timer, and so if it flips when I'm still talking, I may. These are just various versions of what you can do, different expenditure levels, different design levels. This one's got ducks in it, or chickens, or whatever there is back there. And this is a front yard in the Westbury area of Houston. Fruit trees, those are persimmons, and more fruit trees and habitat and other things in the front yard. This one, a yard of the month club for that whole area. So there's many things that you can do with a front yard as well as a backyard. And this is part of the design in some ways, and we'll get to that in a bit. Here are the main ideas. Work with nature. Learn from forests and prairies. These forests and prairies don't get sprayed, they don't get fertilized, and they're highly productive if you talk about what they actually grow. Lots and lots of plants. And if you learn from how this works, you can actually grow a very good set of food crops with a minimal amount of unenjoyable work. Lots of enjoyable work, I might add. We aim at improving things, not depleting things. And we don't want to poison ourselves or anybody else. And a lot of us think that having a lot of things moving around in the landscape, like lizards and birds and butterflies, is a good thing. It makes the garden attractive, and so on. So there are a lot of things to this. In nature, nobody tills the soil. Basically, you get a lot of organic matter on the surface. It improves the soil. If you're going to add things to the soil, it ought to be things that would be found in nature. And that's pretty much what we do when we do organic approaches in general. We try to duplicate nature, help it along, if anything, and so on. That's the basic approach to the thing. There's a lot more involved. This is a permaculture design, comes out of my new book. And this is way more stuff than we could possibly talk about here, because we're actually just talking about vegetables rather than the overall concepts. But there's things that are important here, like getting lots and lots of yields from connections and relationships and edges, and all sorts of things that keep you from having trouble. Don't have a diversity of things so that you don't depend on just one crop and so on. So that's the basic concepts, the overall principles. The building of the vegetable garden is another interesting trick. There's a lot of possible questions to ask. If you were starting out with that, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want with your vegetables? We want 12 months of vegetables, and I can tell you that August and early September, one of the weakest parts of the year for us in vegetables. But I have a lot of squash at the moment, okra, long beans, southern peas, and probably peppers. I've got eggplants, basil, which I make a lot of pesto. So the question is, well, what are your goals? And how much time do you have and how much help do you have? And I can tell you help is really important. Nancy does as much work in that garden as I do. It really makes a big difference, especially when I'm busy or something, that she is out there doing some work. Although it's pouring rain here, so it's not today. How much space do you have? How much, and space is a two-sided coin here. If you produce a bigger garden than you can take care of, then that's not a very good idea either. So you should always start small with a vegetable garden, and then, but if you can design it in such a way that you can add if you decide you want more. We have quite a large vegetable garden, and we produce most of our own vegetables, and they're way better than what's available anywhere else. How much sun do you have? If you eat the leaves, most of them, if it's a bright shade, most of them will grow if it's just leaves, like lettuce or parsley or something. But if you are eating the fruits, like certainly the squashes and tomatoes and corn, but also broccoli and cauliflower and things like that, those things need a lot of sun. We'll get to that in a little bit. Trees are another issue. They not only create shade, but sometimes they compete with vegetable gardens. So it's something to pay attention to. Water, it's two sides. One is you need to be able to get enough water to the garden, and you also don't want too much water. So it needs to be, take care of that. And so that's another issue. Appearance and fit, what does it need to look like from your point of view, looking out your back window, or how does it fit in with your neighborhood? It may be important to you, may not be important, but it is an issue to think about. Money is another question. One of the things is that there's generally cheap ways to do things and expensive ways to do things. And a lot of times the expensive way looks better, doesn't do much better job delivering food, but whatever amount of money you want to invest in, it's worth mentioning that things can be improved over time. So it isn't necessary that you all spend a lot of money all at once. Site drainage is really important. You don't want to plant it anywhere where you're likely to get a flood. So there's a bunch of issues there. One of the things about sun is to look at different times of the year. You should take at least a year's worth of sun observations. Look where your sun is in the middle of the day, early in the day, late in the day, at least in each of the 4 seasons, middle of the summer, middle of the fall, middle of the winter, and so on. Because you really want to plant your vegetable gardens where they're going to get a lot of sun. At least, I would say 8 hours is a good amount. 6 you can make do with, and so on. So you need to have that in mind. Wind is another question. In very cold winds that come out of the north, the so-called panhandle winds, those things can really cause problems. And the more you can block them on a cold winter night, the better off you're going to do with a winter vegetable garden, especially in the Woodlands area and further north. There are things you can do about that, but you really want to try to block those winds if possible, and there's ways to do that. The summer winds connected with a tropical storm or something or another question, so they're pretty good to block those somewhat too. So these are some tips about what you could do to block wind. And again, a lot of that would take, some of that would take years to develop if you're talking about planting shrubbery or trees. But you should try whatever you do. If you use plants for a windbreak, you should try to get some other uses out of it. Certain types of honeysuckle will attract hummingbirds. Wax myrtle will attract migrating birds to eat them. Phaeoas are a good fruit, or pineapple, guava, and so on. And so I guess the main thing is to give some attention to that, especially in cold weather. Water's another question. Where is your water going to come from? How long a hose are we talking about? Are you going to get water from a hose, and where is the nearest water tap? It's an important question. You may have to, and it may be useful to get a water tap near your vegetable garden. Either do it yourself or pay a plumber. And drip systems are a really good method of watering vegetable gardens. I think the best company around to do that is DripWorks, dripworks.com. I want to mention that if you're thinking about taking notes, if you're using a computer's desktop or a laptop, you can do a screen capture of some of these things to get yourself some notes, and can do that on a cell phone as well. Different formats do different things. On a Macintosh, it's Command-Shift-4. On an iPhone, it's pressing the button at the bottom and the button on the right at the same time. Apparently will do that too. So how do you do your vegetable garden? Well, this looks really nice. This picture on the left and the one on the right looks very nice. But question I have is, how do you weed that thing? How do you weed it? What do? Walk down those rows? And when you walk down the rows, all you're doing is squashing the air out of the soil. And it's pretty darn hard to even get down and weed those things. So I'm looking at that and wondering, how on earth did those folks weed that? It's unbelievable. Basically, I don't recommend this style. Country rows are were developed for tilling and plows, and those methods are not good ways to treat southern soils. You might have to do it if you had a large farm, but it isn't a good way to treat your soil. So we don't recommend tillers. We don't recommend any kind of plowing at all. And we'll get to that in a bit. Rather, what we want is some sort of raised bed, basically not too wide, with a path so that you can walk down it. And deal with what's there and reach the middle without standing in the bed. That's the basic idea. We want this thing to be running north-south. And here are some dimensions for beds. If you're talking about young kids, no wider than 3 foot, 10 foot's a good length, but and larger kids can be up to 4, like high school kids or middle school kids. Adults should be 4 foot or 5 foot wide beds, and any length basically that's practical. I like 5 feet because things like sweet potatoes and melons and stuff in the summertime spread out long distances. A lot of people like 4 feet because it's much easier to reach things in the middle of the bed without standing in it. And if you're short, particularly, or have problems with your legs, 4 feet may be better. Your paths should be typically 2 to 3 feet wide unless you have likely to be using it with a wheelchair. And 2 to 3 feet for me, I use a lawnmower, so I want it to be wide enough for the lawnmower, but it's also a good width for wheelbarrows and for simply not likely to fall, or it's get down to a foot, it starts getting tricky walking. There are a lot of questions that you come up, and you might question, like if you're hauling a hose around a garden, what's going to happen when you start pulling on the hose? Is it going to go into the bed, and so on? So you need to actually think a bit about this. Like, how would you water this one right here? We recommend designing your garden on some kind of paper or computer. A lot of people, when they design on paper, use transparent paper from art supply places so they can put one layer on top of another. But you want to create your space. You want to put in anything like a tree or a building or a utility line or anything else that's there. It's called a base map. And then measure everything that you're planning to have, figure out where the directions are and where shade is going to be, and basically create a diagram of what you're planning to build or would like to build, I think we have to say. This is one I did on a computer for a friend's backyard some years ago. And this is just a spreadsheet with a draw program and setting, this is to scale. 1 block is 1 square foot. And, you know, you can put photos of things you're going to put there in there. You can. And the thing I want to particularly point out is that this is a mid-August perspective at 5 p.m. And this is the shade from the house going right in here. That's a 500-gallon rainwater cistern, which was a plan, never actually got done, I saw. These are all vegetable beds. It's a pretty small backyard townhouse, but point being is there's a lot of stuff you can do. And so the question of where you might put a compost pile, for example, in there or something like that. So that's essentially some of the design questions. There's certainly much more could be said about that. We typically, when we're building block frame beds, whatever thing you're using for a raised bed, you need to pay some attention to the size of them. If you're using concrete or blocks, they're typically like 8 inches wide or 4 inches wide or some other sort of thing like that. any place that basically sells concrete blocks. There's way more than Home Depot or Lowe's that do that throughout Southeast Texas, but those are places that do sell those things. This is a Windsor retaining wall. Those are really easy to create curves. Curves are neat in look, but they're also harder if you're using a lawnmower to mow around. These are solid and hollow blocks. The solid blocks are twice the weight of this and more expensive. The hollow ones can be lined up along here like this with one solid block at each corner. And you can save yourself some money and some heavy work. This is another one. If you're interested in something like this, you should do a screen capture of it, or just wrote down the name Cresco. You can probably find it. But there are many possible things. If you're want to do something yourself and you just got a car, cedar fence slats work pretty good. Those are braced with rebar on the outside. You can sort of see the rebar right here. And there are many, many other ways to do it. This is one without any frame at all. Here is one they did at Fur High School, which is just a bunch of hay bales. And this one here, for somebody who thought maybe they were going to have to move or something, might be a good thing to do. Wood doesn't last very long unless it's treated, and treated doesn't work very good in vegetable gardens, because it's got anti-fungicidal things in it, and fungi are actually good in gardens. Logs are another possibility. They look rather good in a naturalistic habitat garden. The issue of soil is another thing. Some of you may have sandy soil if you're in that part of the world. And there you just talk about add a lot of organic matter to the soil. But if you have clay, best thing you can do is add about 8 inches of excellent soil on top of the land, because it gets you drainage and quality soil, at least to start. Generally, you just lay down some newspaper, cardboard, and pile the dirt on top of it, and then add a bunch of fertilizer. So you need quality compost in it. Sand doesn't do you any good at all. It's virtually no use at all in the garden. And there's a lot of bad compost out there. I use Nature's Way resources myself. There are other companies in Southeast Texas, lots of them. And I'm not willing to say much about any of the rest of them, but some of them may have some good products. I don't know that particularly. You're going to need to, if you put stuff on top of the ground, you're going to need to put something under it to stop plants. We don't use plastic. We need something that will rot. And that plastic, if it rots, is just going to cause a mess. So you don't want that. So here's basically what they're doing, putting down stuff to suppress. This was at Rice University, the newspaper. If you're going with rectangular beds, you can lay them out with string and stakes like that and get them really sharp. You fill up with dirt, and you need these things to be level. So level from here to here and level from here to here. Otherwise, when it rains, water will just pour off the top if it's on a slope. So what you want is when it rains for water to go straight down, and if there's too much water, for it to come out at the bottom here. But basically what we're talking about is keeping our rainwater where it falls. And You can put stuff under blocks, whether it's dirt you have there or something you buy. The basic thing is to make sure that the thing ends up looking nice and it's all level. These are just one of the people who took my 25-hour growing organic vegetables class with Urban Harvest years ago, sent me this set of things of them building a garden. And this gives you some sense of what you can do if you want some exercise and are sick of going to the gym because of the virus. This is something you could actually do yourself. You can also get this sort of soil delivered if for a little more cost if you don't have a pickup truck handy. For watering, most vegetables have shallow roots. So they don't do well if the topsoil in the top few inches is dry. That mostly happens during hot summer weather rather than the fall and late fall and winter. So it won't be as much of a problem for fall gardening, but if you're designing your garden, you want to be able to water it year round if necessary. Newly planted seeds, they don't have much in the way of roots. They're like newborn babies. They just simply cannot cope without water. It is worth keeping in mind that you're going to need to be able to do some watering. Good mulches, high quality biological mulches will prevent these problems a lot if the plants have got some fairly good roots. And the plant is fairly big already and you water it from the air. In certain temperatures, it'll promote fungus, especially for many vegetable plants. Tomatoes, beans, squash, none of them are happy getting watered from the air. Right now, I'm getting rain on some of these plants, and they're not going to like it. But young plants, when they're really small, actually do very well being watered from the air, and it's practically the only way to get them properly damp. If you were doing mature plants, you want to get your hose watering the soil, not the plant. If it were seedlings, you can use a nozzle to spray them. The best way to do mature plants is with a drip sprinkler system, drip works or something like that, and I'll show you some pictures in a few minutes. And overhead things like sprinklers are cheap and easy, but they are really bad for vegetable gardens. They'll mess up your sweet potatoes, they mess up all sorts of things, especially in the summer, spring, and fall. And ditch irrigation, something you use in desert situations and stuff like that. So one way to water gardens is basically to just adjust whatever you have on your hose so as to just put water in the center of a bed while you're out there doing something else. You can get a lot of water in that way. But here are some examples. You can attach a PVC to an outdoor tap and run it into the garden and create yourself water taps that allow you to do a hose. There are a variety of different nozzles. I like this one from Dram a lot better than these. This thing is a very useful tool from DripWorks. It allows you to trickle water in there. It's also being used here for this nozzle. And this is also a really good device if you prefer this sort of thing to this, because one of the things is that if you put one of these on the end here, you can control how much water comes out and where exactly you put it. I want to say with hoses, there are all kinds of hoses. These are the most expensive, but looking for a lifetime warranty on a hose is very much worth doing if you're not too short of money. Installing a drip system is lots of fun, haha. But once you've done it, you really can be pleased with the result. And it's not that hard to do in terms of mentally hard to do. If you have a garden that's too big for you to water, then you probably need this system. I highly recommend, though, that you have the ability to repair it yourself. That if you're not willing to repair it yourself and learn how to do that, probably you'd be better off with something you can understand, like a hose and a nozzle. Soil fertility is another issue. And the problem with soils is that there are all sorts of things that could live in the soil that will bother your vegetable plants. And one of the neat things about it is that if you do an organic soil the right way, most of these things will be minor or not at all. And that is that we know why that is, and I'm about to explain it. But this is a root rot spores, Pythium root rot, and there are many kinds of root rots, but that's a common one. Root feeding nematodes that go munching. See, notice the snout on this little microscopic worm. And the problem, of course, is that most microbes in the soil are near the surface because that's where the food is, since most of them eat that. If you take this thing here, what you are doing is destroying the microbial web in the soil. So you are forcing yourself into a situation where you have to take the place of billions of microbes. And you may have other things to do. This is not fun to do. I've done it. And so I don't recommend tilling at all for anybody who's doing home gardening, and not really even for people doing farming, but it gets harder to do if you're doing acres. So that's a different question. But anyway, 1986, they got the digital electron microscope running. And ever since then, soil science has just totally changed. We ended up, this is a very simple version of what goes on in the soil. Namely, plants die and develop wastes, as does manures and dead animals and so on. And fungi and bacteria, and these are root feeding nematodes, they eat this stuff. And then these things, these arthropods, eat the bacteria, and they eat the fungi, and the nematodes eat the fungi, and the nematodes eat the bacteria, and the protozoa eat the bacteria. And then there are nematodes that eat nematodes, and nematodes that eat bacteria, and you get the picture here. And we're living up here somewheres or other on top of this. But basically, there's thousands of things going on here. This is a very simple picture, but that's what's going on in your soil. And so what we are doing with the soil is trying to raise a really outstanding collection of these things. So we add a lot of organic matter to the surface of the soil, just like you would do in nature. And this feeds calories to these bacteria and fungi. And then these provide nutrients to plant roots through a variety of fungi. and they take minerals bound up in the clay. They create soil tilth through gums and gels, which provides tilth means there's a whole lot of oxygen space in there, and so they can breathe, and there's water. Water sinks in, and it gets that lovely crumbly soil that you all want in your garden. And one of the things that happens is that things that eat bacteria and things that eat fungi in the soil also eat disease bacteria and disease fungi. So in other words, you're putting a fox in there to control the rabbits. So when we put fertilizers on a vegetable garden, what we want to do is put stuff in there that might have actually showed up in nature, whether or not it did. And so these are the things we use for fertilizers, but we use mulches on top made out of a quality stuff. So pine bark is not a good mulch for vegetable gardens because it isn't tempting. Bark was designed to resist attack from fungi. What we want is stuff that fungi love to eat. So you put high quality stuff on the surface. And what happens then is these microbes eat these things, and so this is the first principle here. Organic matter feeds the soil. Keep it on the surface and a lot of good things will happen. That's nature right there. And what happens is when you feed the fungi and bacteria, what will happen is that the fungi decompose woody stuff, bacteria do the green juicy matter, lawn clippings, leaves, anything that fall down. And they get their calories, their energy from that. And then what happens is that these things, these bacteria and these nematodes, these fungi, these are very high in nitrogen. And when these other animals eat them, they are not so high in nitrogen. So a whole bunch of nitrogen goes out into the soil. And so what happens is, and phosphorus as well, so what happens is that they dump these wastes where the roots of the plants can consume them. And they're in exactly the form in which the plants love to get them. So the basic thing is that you can create a lot of what amounts to microbe manure and microbe bone meal and things like that in the soil by feeding the microbes. And what happens here with fungi is fungi are what basically create soil tilth. Roots, air, and water, they need an aggregate, crumbly soil, not some gummy mass of clay. And so what we're doing here is getting fungi, bacteria glue particles together with gums and gels, and then fungi grow through them and strengthen it into little crumbly clumps, and which is why a good soil is so crumbly. And so there's a whole bunch of things that happen there when you do it, but mainly if you just feed the microbes, this will happen. You'll have a good soil. So here's some pictures, protozoa. There's a protozoa getting ready to eat a bacteria. Here's a bacteria feeding nematode. Look at the snout on this thing. It eats bacteria. This one is a nematode that eats fungi. Look at the snout on that one. This is a nematode that eats nematodes. It's got a big mouth, as you can see. So once you have this kind of web, these microbes produce hormones and other things that plants like. They also, some of the mycorrhizae put themselves in the roots of plants. And when they do, they send out little tiny root-like structures far beyond anything the roots of the plant could do. And so what happens is plants get carbon from the air and they make it into sugars, which they feed to the microbes. And the microbes, on the other hand, get stuff from the soil, minerals and things, and feed it to the plants. There are some fungus, mycorrhizae, and they're putting out these long root-like structures into the soil. And balanced organic fertilizer is another part of this. There are quite a few brands available. This is the one that I like the best. This is local Houston area fertilizer. It's got a better version of this, I think, but there are lots of kinds around that do well. As to how much you use, it really depends on how fertile your soil is, which means how well do they grow. But generally 1/4 to 1 cup per square foot, at least just dug slightly into the top of the soil just before you plant. That's the simplest way. If you want to understand soil biology a little bit better, you can do a search on the web for soil biology primer. It is online. You can, the left-hand side is chapter by chapter. It is very easy to understand description of what happens in the soil to make plants grow well. Now, what do we do about pests? What do you think? Just spray them? That is not a good approach. Why is it not a good approach? Well, the big problem is pesticides don't permanently solve the problem. Whatever the pest is going to be back next year or next month. And a lot of them make the problem worse because they destroy the things that otherwise would control them. They're hazardous to the health. I could go into this in a long list of reasons why they are, but they're, as you might know, Roundup has been successfully sued for causing cancer. And the more you get exposed to it, the worse it is. And then, of course, you're going to have to wash out the tank. And where are you going to put those pesticides? They're all over the place. This thing is very hard to research pesticides on people. So I don't recommend using poisons as a way to control pests. This is what I actually recommend. Start by not using anything that's toxic to nature. Don't do it. Do everything possible to have healthy plants. That's every horticulturist in the world will tell you that. Then this thing, build biodiversity, create habitat in a balanced ecosystem. That means lots and lots of kinds of plants, lots and lots of kinds of habitats, meaning dry, wet, shady, sunny, windy, not windy, so on. Sandy, not sandy, and so on. Trees, root, vines, whatever. Help creatures. The pests need to have pests. That's the key point here. Sometimes they have to wait for the pest to find their own, the pests of the pest to find the pest. But the point being is that there are all sorts of things that will destroy pests because they like to consume them one way or another. If that doesn't work, I use some barriers from time to time. I've got a net on my grapevines at the moment. You can trap things, but all of these things get harder to do and they're not as effective and they're more expensive. And only very rarely or very high economic situations would I use any kind of even organic poison. This is basically my main strategy right here, and I'll explain what I do. We encourage the predators of the things we want to get destroyed. And predators, there are all kinds of predators, and they have many different forms. And in a natural landscape, there could be thousands of these things per acre, and a lot of parasitoids. A parasitoid kills, lays eggs or something in the pest and kills it. And parasites normally don't kill it, but a parasitoid does. And each one of these things might not be a big thing, but all of them together do. So there are lots and lots of kinds of insects, as well as birds and lizards and so on, that do things that kill and eat bugs, pests. And the main thing is that once you start spraying anything, you're liable to kill some of these things. Anyway, and we don't know just what all these things are, but I can tell you they work. For a parasitoid to be attracted to your garden, they need the right kind of flower and nectar when they're adults. If they have something to consume themselves, they will lay eggs in nearby insects. And so you need to do the right thing there, and I'll tell you how to do that in a moment. So typically you have a leaf-eating host like a caterpillar or larva of some sort, and they lay eggs in it. The immature parasitoid develops on this, feeding on body fluids and so on, and then it so-called hatches and whatever. So there's many ways to get such folks in your garden. Native plants do a really good job of that. Flowers year-round that attract beneficial insects, and lots of water here and there like bird baths, and heavy mulches and not poisoning, and flowers year-round. So here are some examples of things that bring in beneficials. Carolina buckthorn's a native, cilantro, alyssum, and so on. Italian parsley in bloom, carrots in bloom, water, mulch. And here are just some of the insects you could easily attract. Spider mite predators, lacewing predators. There's marsh flies, really common in February in my yard. There's its larva. Hoverflies, hoverfly going after caterpillar here. Ladybug, a larva attacking things. Tachnid or flesh flies, they look like house flies, but they're basically laying eggs on caterpillars. Ground beetles live under rocks. Red wasp, green lynx. all these, the carrot family plants we'll be talking about later, all of these things, when they bloom, they bring in these beneficial wasps. These are non-stinging wasps, but they lay eggs in or on various pests. And so if you've got a problem, one of the things you could do is just wait for the beneficial populations to build up and take care of them. There's always going to be more pests than there are predators, but eventually predators will typically find it. So unless it is really costing you a lot of problems, you can so that is essentially, unless it's a lot of problems, there's no real issue here in terms of waiting. A lot of times when I have a pest problem, all I do is wait. Sometimes I will trap them or something else, but usually the real thing to do is just figure something will eat them eventually. The older you do this, the more years you do this, the better ecosystem you'll have for doing this, and it'll balance out. Okay, so I'm able to take some questions now, and we'll take about, I guess, 10 minutes of questions, and then about 10 minutes of break.
Here's your first question, Dr. Randall.
Mm-hmm.
How can you maximize space in a small garden other than using cages for vining vegetables?
Well, of course, there's a question of how small. The smallest garden I ever had was on the balcony of a second floor apartment, and that wasn't very big. But in a, let's say, small vegetable garden, the most important thing you can do is plan really, really carefully, like what is going to be planted when. A year, plan it out for the whole year. And there's a method for doing that in my book, one I published in 2019, Year-Round Food Gardening for Houston and Southeast Texas. That has a whole method for planning. And so what you want is to have something productive every week of the year. That's one thing to say. The second thing is planting in grids. So if you look at the back of a seed package, you'll see something like, well, it says plant carrots in a row, let's say 18 inches apart and 2-inch spacing but in the row. And in fact, you can plant carrots 2 inches spacing in the row, but in a raised bed, you can also plant them 2 inches across the row also, so that you can easily get 6 carrots to a foot and 36 carrots in a square foot. So the so-called square foot gardening, you don't need rows the way it says on seed packages if you're not walking between the rows. If a plant will grow with a 2-inch spacing in the row, it will grow that spacing in both directions. So that's one way. A lot of people waste an awful lot of space in gardens, is just really knowing how much distance you actually need between plants and covering the whole bed that way. And some things are way more productive than other things. And that's another question. So, another question?
Thank you, Dr. Randall. The next question is, could you please address solarizing soil?
Okay, well, solarizing soil consists of putting a clear, usually clear plastic, either black plastic or clear plastic. Some people do one way, some people do another. But the idea is to heat up the soil during the summertime to kill all plants in it and it also kills all microbes in it. So if you did that, it can't possibly be good for soil microbes. So if you had a good soil food web, I'm not sure that's what we would do in nature. On the other hand, if all you've got is, let's say, a stand of Bermuda grass or nut sedge or something, that it's one way to kill it, and at least it's sort of organic in the sense you're not using a herbicide, so you're not putting a weed killer in there. You know, people do that. They stick this thing there and sort of roast the soil is what they do. And I'm not a big fan of it, but at the same time, it's one way to kill a lot of plants if that's what you want to do. You might then need to get a high quality compost and stuff and try to rebuild your soil food web. Okay.
Okay, the next question is, a person has a vegetable garden with a few inches of mulch on top. Should he throw organic matter on top of the mulch or remove the mulch before he adds the organic matter?
Well, it depends what the organic matter is. If it's uncomposted organic matter, it should be on top of the mulch. The bottom layer next to the soil should be very rotted, whatever it is. So if it's very rotted organic matter, they could do either one. And the question is, what is the mulch like also?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The next question is, how can you naturally eliminate squash bugs?
Are we talking about are we talking about squash vine borers or squash bugs?
I'm not sure.
Well, the most common problem on things like zucchini is squash vine borer, which gets in the stem of the squash and then pretty much kills it. And the easiest way to deal with that problem is not to grow those kinds of squashes. The squash that's very resistant is any relative of the butternut squash, which is Cucurbita moscata species. So it's butternut and quite a few other squashes in that family. What they do is put out long vines, and at every leaf node, they put down roots into the soil. And if you plant a fairly sizable bed of these squashes during say late March, and where I am in Houston, it may be a little bit later than that, maybe early April in the Woodlands. If you plant them then, and you can get a good stand. They don't produce for about 100 days. But if you get them running along a fairly large bed, they will root everywhere, and they're pretty resistant to stem borers. You can also split the stem open when you see an infection and root out the caterpillar and then sort of bandage it back up again. But if you try to do it with zucchini or something like that, which is a different species of squash, they're not very resistant. And I'm guessing that that's what the person was asking about, not really what's known as a squash bug. But squash bugs, I don't generally run into the problem with squash bugs because my ecology is good enough. And I suspect that's what would happen if you followed what I said about pest management.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And this person would like you to address how you feel about compost tea, high quality compost tea.
High quality compost tea is, it has to be made the right way, which is 24 hours with proper aeration, non-chlorinated water, and a high quality compost. And there's a few other things involved. But high quality compost tea what it does if you spray it on a plant is it coats the plant with a high level of quality microbes, and they tend to go after on the plant any kind of bacterial fungi infections of the leaves. So that is a valuable thing to do in terms of the plant leaf. I would say that I don't have enough experimental evidence to know exactly which things it works really well on or something like that, but the science is good. As far as a drench in the soil, I'm not sure there's any real advantage to it beyond simply putting compost down and dumping a mulch on top of it. I don't know that you need to liquefy it for any given reason, and probably not a particularly good idea. Maybe it works better. It depends I think in the hands of a professional, it probably works really well. The question is, what are you getting if you're, say, a backyard gardener, unless you're using a microscope?
Thank you, Dr. Randall. We're going to take a 10-minute break now. So it is 10:13. So take a break, get some coffee and a snack, and come back at 10:23.